I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here this evening. And I'm very pleased that you could join us, whether you're joining us here in person, joining us on our YouTube station, or a special welcome to our C-SPAN audience. At the end of this month, we mark the 50th anniversary of one of the key events of the Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive. Tonight we'll hear from a panel of experts about its consequences in Vietnam and in the United States. Our partner for this program is the U.S. Army Center of Military History, and we thank them for their support. We're honored to have former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel as our keynote speaker for today's panel discussion of the Tet Offensive. And following the discussion, Erik Villard will sign copies of his book, Combat Operations. But before we start, I want to tell you about two other programs coming up here soon. Tomorrow at noon, Constitutional Professor Gerald Maglioka will be here to talk about his new book, The Heart of the Constitution, How the Bill of Rights Became the Bill of Rights. And on Thursday, February 1st at 7, we will partner with the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress for a program called Meet the Better Half, Congressional Partners, Spouses, and Families. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events at archives.gov. And another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications for membership in the lobby or at archivesfoundation.org. And a little known secret that I keep telling everyone, no one has ever been turned down for membership in the National Archives Foundation. Tonight's program is part of a series of discussions, films, lectures, and other programs that tie into our current special exhibit, Remembering Vietnam, upstairs in the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery. The exhibit is a fascinating collection of newly discovered and iconic original documents, images, film footage, and artifacts that illuminate 12 critical episodes in the war that divided peoples of both the United States and Vietnam. One of those episodes focuses on the Tet Offensive. Documents and photographs from the National Archives and its presidential libraries describe the attacks and their consequences. A particular blow to American public opinion of the war was the Viet Cong infiltration of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, represented in the exhibit by a map of the defense of the embassy and a memo describing the breach. If you haven't already gone through the exhibit, I encourage you to come back and spend some time there. Remembering Vietnam explores the war not only through documents, but also through interviews with American and Vietnamese veterans and civilians and firsthand experience of the war's events. Now I ask all Vietnam veterans of any United States veteran who served on active duty in the U.S. Armed Forces at any time during the period November 1st to 1955 to May 15th, 1975, to stand and be recognized. Veterans, as you exit the McGowan Theater this evening, National Archives staff and volunteers will present each of you with the Vietnam Veteran Lapel pin. On the back of the pin is embossed, "A grateful nation thanks and honors you." The United States of America Vietnam War commemoration is a national initiative, and the lapel pin is the nation's lasting memento of thanks. To get our discussion started, I'll turn the lectern over to Charles F. Bowery, Jr., who is the Executive Director of the U.S. Army Center of Military History, Department of the Army. A retired colonel, Charles Bowery was commissioned to the aviation branch of the U.S. Army in 1988. He's seen service in the Pentagon and also served overseas in Korea, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He's taught history at West Point from 2001 to 2003 and served as the Chief of Doctrine and Lessons Learned at the U.S. Army Aviation Center of Excellence. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Charles Bowery, Jr.
Well, good evening, and I'll also extend my welcome to the National Archives, and I'd like to begin by thanking David Ferrero, and the staff of the National Archives for partnering with the Center of Military History to host this great event. All of us historians see the National Archives as our personal nirvana. It's the place where we go. Much of our research is done here, and I would also commend their outstanding Vietnam exhibit to you if you haven't seen it. Tonight we celebrate the release of the 12th volume in the CMH's official history series, The United States Army in Vietnam. In Staying in the Course, Dr. Erik Villard chronicles U.S. Army operations across Vietnam from October 1967 to September 1968, including, of course, the period of the Tet Offensive. On the morning of 28 January 1968, the North Vietnamese Ministry of Defense notified its Southern Front commands via an encrypted radio transmission that the general offensive was to begin at midnight of between the first and second days of Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, and a national holiday. Attacks across the country began the next day and continued for 3 weeks or more, engulfing South Vietnam in savage fighting that left thousands dead on both sides and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese rendered homeless and destitute. By any measure, the Tet Offensive was one of the most significant events of the 20th century, and the publication of this book at the 50th anniversary of Tet serves two purposes. First, it adds to our continuing national conversation about Vietnam, and it helps us to remember the service and sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of Army soldiers. This is significant in that our chief historian, John Hoffman, writes in the book's foreword, half of the U.S. population now is too young to have a direct memory of the Vietnam War. The spirited discussion and strident critiques surrounding the recent Ken Burns documentary on Vietnam tell us that these are not mere historiographical debates, and that this is a teachable moment for our nation to come to a reckoning with the costs of making war. Second, and equally important for me personally, this event demonstrates that the U.S. Army is a learning organization, committed to interrogating its past in the pursuit of a more effective future force. We will continue this process in March with a My Lai at 50 symposium at the Pentagon, co-hosted by CMH, the Army's Judge Advocate General, and the Center for Army Professional Ethic at West Point. The Vietnam War still has much to say about our current Army. And as I listened to Mr. Ferrero talk about the exhibit and the Tet artifacts contained in it, I had a moment to think about another fringe benefit of my job, which is being in charge of the Army's museums. And I'll highlight a piece in our collection that has a direct relationship to Tet. If you visit the Army's Military Police Corps Museum at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, you'll see a Jeep in the collection at Fort Leonard Wood in the MP Corps Museum. And that Jeep is present in many of the iconic photos about, that depict the fighting around the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. That Jeep carried the military police quick reaction force that reacted to the attack on the embassy. So that vehicle is sitting in our museum at Fort Leonard Wood as a tangible reminder of Army service during the Tet Offensive. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker this evening. Chuck Hagel served as the 24th Secretary of Defense from February 2013 to February 2015, and he's the only Vietnam veteran and first ever enlisted combat veteran to serve as our Secretary of Defense. Secretary Hagel also served 2 terms in the United States Senate representing the state of Nebraska. Secretary Hagel has also chaired the Atlantic Council, the U.S. Vietnam War Commemoration Advisory Committee, and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund Corporate Council. Beginning in late 1967, Secretary Hagel and his brother Tom served together in Vietnam in the 2nd Battalion, 47th Infantry Regiment, part of the 9th Infantry Division. The photo on the cover of Staying in the Course depicts Secretary Hagel's company in action in May 1968. Secretary Hagel.
Thank you, and thank you for your service to our country. Mr. Ferrero, thank you for hosting this event and all that the National Archives do for our country. National Archives is truly a national treasure that affects and reaches into every home in our country, as well as telling the story to the world of who we are as a people and as a nation. So thank you for what you and your colleagues do every day for our country. Dr. Villard, congratulations on your book. It's, I don't know, 5,000 pages. But I know the scholars will appreciate it. But rummaging through it a little and getting a sense of what you cover, it's a pretty masterfully written and historic document that I know will make endless contributions to educational institutions across this country for years to come. So I congratulate you on a terrific accomplishment. To our veterans here who have already been recognized, thank you for your service to our country and your families, what your families have contributed. Often, I think the spouses of our military get left out, and the families and the children get left out in recognition, and they shouldn't. They make as many or maybe more sacrifices than the active duty people who serve our country. So to all of you, thank you. My assignment tonight, and I know it's risky having a former senator up here and not put some time limits on him, but I will adhere to the strict guidelines that they've asked me to make some comments about certainly the Tet Offensive 1968 because I was there. So I will share some of my thoughts, maybe initial thoughts at the time, and then how over the years I've come to assess what happened. First, it is my opinion that the Tet Offensive was probably the most defining event of the Vietnam War. I think also 1968 was probably the most defining year of that war. And when you review, as Dr. Villard does in his book, many publications, many shows, the Ken Burns documentary, which I think is brilliantly done and very fair, we now understand a lot. What happened, what didn't happen, why it happened. And so it leads us, at least to, it does for me, to the conclusion that this event, 1968, that year, really defined the course for the rest of the war and the end of the war. And in many respects, how it ended, which was a pretty inglorious ending. And the sacrifices made by over 56,000 Americans who lost their lives and the hundreds of thousands of individuals who were wounded, and those all who served, were, as we know, never really given much recognition for an assignment that they didn't choose, but they served, and they served honorably. They served their country and did what their country asked them to do. And I think that's a part of this story that needs to be told more often, in that our Vietnam veterans came back. They didn't view themselves as heroes. They viewed themselves like all of our veterans of all of our wars. They did the job that their country asked them to do. It wasn't their decision, but it was their country, and they did it honorably. They did it in a way that sustained them, as all wars are sustained by the camaraderie of the individual, looking out for each other, believing in each other, and yes, believing in your mission and believing in your country. That's an untold story in many ways. Now there's more recognition, of course, today, the whole welcome home effort, but it is a story that I think threads throughout every dimension of what happened in Vietnam, and not just 1968. The morning of January 31st, my unit was a mechanized infantry unit that was assigned to the Michelin rubber plantation security because intelligence had showed that the Viet Cong had a significant number, maybe battalion size, of fighters in that area and using the plantation as a refuge. And we were alerted at about 5:30 in the morning of January 31st to assemble and put our tracks on the road and head for Long Binh. Long Binh at the time was the largest ammunition depot in the world. MACV, under the command of General Westmoreland, had a major office there. Across the street from that facility was a place called Widow's Village, and it was set up by the Vietnamese government, the South Vietnamese government, for the widows of fallen South Vietnamese soldiers and their families. The VC had gotten into that village the night before and slaughtered all of the people and used that village as a staging area for the next morning to attack the Long Binh ammunition depot. And so as my tracks were moving into that area at between 6:30 in the morning, the explosions were things that we had never ever heard before, seen before. It was like, it must have been like somewhat of an atomic explosion. And we didn't know where we were going really, or what truly the assignment was, or what was happening. And that really personified Tet in many ways, certainly for the first few weeks, until we started to intelligence and assess strategies and what was happening and why. But nobody knew. And this was happening across Vietnam for 3 weeks. But initially, the shock of all this during a truce, and probably also the shock of completely underestimating the strength of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. And all of that came together, which resulted in a terrible, terrible loss of life. Although part of the story that rarely gets told, too, is that our military actually did pretty well. In fact, very well, considering. And it was seen as and broadcast as a great loss for America and a great win for the VC and the North Vietnamese. It was certainly, not militarily, a win for the VC and the North Vietnamese, but it was certainly a win for them with attitudes with the people of South Vietnam. And in the end, as we all know, that's all and that counts, because in the end, wars are determined, certainly the wars post-World War II, are determined not by military might, but it's the support of the people and the support of the recognition of what kind of life do we want, what kind of life do people deserve. And the United States found itself on the wrong side of that. And it wasn't just Tet, it wasn't just the military side of that, but every documentary now out, Ken Burns, if you've seen the recent movie The Post or any other movies, they all tell that same story. And there's a lesson, obviously, in that, a lesson for today in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in all these regional and localized conflicts, that without the support of the people, you will not win, regardless of the strength of your military. And you put your military in a very unfair position when you load it onto the military as it's the military's responsibility to win over the people. And we tried that in Vietnam through all the different actions, and we did try that. But in the end, it is the culture, the people, and their attitude toward the forces that are involved in the conflict. That morning, I was a young 21-year-old private first class who had been in Vietnam 2 months. And so I was not thinking grand geopolitical thoughts. I didn't think many grand geopolitical thoughts in my year in Vietnam. But like all soldiers, and we have many here, you think of survival and how you protect each other, and what it is that threads that camaraderie together. In America's case, and now after I've had some wonderful privileges in my life, experiences in different jobs, it's as clear to me as any one thing that the decency of America is always the, I speak of defining things, the defining dynamic in who we are. And that showed as much as anything, as I have reflected so many times over so many years on those days in Vietnam with people that my brother and I served with that we didn't know. And in those days, you went to Vietnam independently. You didn't go in a unit. And that made it more difficult because you were thrown in with people from the time you got on that plane at Oakland Travis Air Force Base to go to Tan Son Nhut in Vietnam. You didn't know anybody. You didn't train with any of the people. And you were separated into different units. But you soon bonded because of the decency that I think it's so part of who we are. We're imperfect. We make mistakes. I've never believed that we're God's chosen few. Maybe we are. We'll all find out someday. I'm in no hurry. But there is something special about the American soldier. And I think as I end my comments here, that's one message that I wanted to impart. And everyone here who has worn the uniform of the United States military, regardless of the service, understands that. And every family member understands that. And when I had the great privilege of leading the Pentagon, I saw that up close. There wasn't a decision I ever made as Secretary of Defense or as a United States Senator that I didn't think about my experience in Vietnam. Some were big decisions, some were not big decisions. But I always tried to reflect on the experience that I had in Vietnam, the people that I learned so much from in Vietnam, people who were from all over the country, many uneducated. Many came from very tough backgrounds, but you learn something from everybody every day. And I'll end this way. An old first sergeant in Vietnam once said to me, we were talking about a number of things. He was from Lake Charles, Louisiana, Sergeant Rose. He said, just always remember, Chuck, that every human being in life, no matter where they're from or their station in life, has a story to tell. And every human being has a book in them about their life. And he said that in regard to service in Vietnam. And in '68, you recall, so much was going on here in the United States. The assassinations of King and Kennedy, the riots, everything was turned upside down. Institutions were being questioned like never before. And I've never forgotten that wisdom that Sergeant Rose imparted with me and to me, because it was a very strong message about how we interact with other people. And I know when you're in war, but you can't ever forget that dimension, that advice that Sergeant Rose said, that everyone deserves respect and everybody wants respect in their life. And I do want to end this way. When I said 1968 was, I think, the defining year of Vietnam, it also was the defining year in this country. It defined an entire future dynamic that was instilled in and affected every institution in our country. Every institution was changed by Vietnam, and it was changed, and 68 defined it. It was changed because it was the first time in our history that the American people started really questioning their government and really started questioning their leaders. And now we understand. But that was the defining dynamic of 1968, that the Tet Offensive really began. It really started. And from that point on, we know the rest of the story, how every institution was turned upside down and changed. And yes, it's imperfect. It didn't all come out right. But I think after reviewing it for 50 years and looking where we are today with all our problems, all our issues, it changed the country for the better, because what it did, it opened up a process. So many things and so many areas of social injustice that had been swept under the rug for so long. It opened all of that up, all of that. So I leave you with that thought, at least coming from me. So many people who served, like my brother and I did, came away with a lot of different thoughts and different opinions. But because I was asked tonight to share some of mine, doesn't mean it's right, and doesn't mean that my observations are better or more knowledgeable than anyone else's. Not at all. But I offer those because it is where I am today in my own mind and my own heart, and it's also maybe a little informed, not just because of my experience in Vietnam with my brother, but also because of the other jobs that I've had the privilege of holding in my life, and that Vietnam experience affected every one of them. Thank you very much.
Before I introduce our three panelists this evening, I'd like to mention that in your program is a blank sheet of paper in the middle. If you have a question that comes to you during our presentations that you'd like to ask to the panelists, our two colleagues from the Center of Military History are stationed on the aisles, and you can pass those questions over to them, and we will read them out in the Q&A period at the end of the presentations. Our first panelist this evening is Dr. Erik Villard, the author of Staying the Course. Erik earned his PhD in history from the University of Washington and currently serves as the digital military historian at CMH. Erik is the founder and president of the Vietnam War History Organization, a Facebook Vietnam veterans group that touches tens of thousands of Vietnam veterans and involves them in their past, and serves as an advisor to several historical and veterans groups. Gregory Daddis is an associate professor of history and director of Chapman University's Master of Arts program in War and Society. A retired U.S. Army colonel, Greg earned his PhD in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and served as the chief of the American History Division in the Department of History at the U.S. Military Academy. Greg is a veteran of Operations Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom and is a published author on the Vietnam War and the Cold War era. Merle L. Pribenow II served in the CIA for 27 years as a language officer, operations officer, and staff officer, including 5 years in Saigon during the Vietnam War. He retired in 1995 and is now an independent researcher and author specializing in the Vietnam War. Dr. Villard.
Well, I'd again like to say thank you for being here, being a part of this. This is really the culmination of a dream of mine. I mean, I knew I wanted to be a Vietnam War historian since forever, pretty much, and I got my wish. So this is a really special occasion, and again, thank you everyone, and Mr. Hagel, and Mr. Bowery, and Mr. O'Keefe, Mr. Fierro, for being a part of this. I just wanted to say a few things about what I thought were maybe some of the big takeaways from the research of my book. I've been working on it a long time, and I could not have done it without the National Archives. Most of the primary documents that I have, I got up at College Park, the other college National Archives branch, and from Mo Pribenow, who taught me more about the Vietnamese communist way of thinking and their sources than anyone. So with those two sources in mind, I just want to walk through about 5 of what I consider some of the big takeaways from the volume. First takeaway, some of you may have heard this argument that the so-called border battle thesis, that in the autumn of 1967, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a series of major battles on the periphery of South Vietnam, starting at Con Thien in northern I Corps, and then going down to Dak To in 2 Corps, Song Bay and Loc Ninh in 3 Corps, with the intention of drawing away American forces from the cities prior to the Tet Offensive so that the communist forces would be better positioned to succeed when Tet happened. No, actually that's not true. And I know this because of the sources from the National Archive, the things that you've given me. The real story is, I think, more interesting. If you understand how the communist military system worked and how it was really very different from the Americans in a lot of respects, what you come to understand is that their process is actually very slow. And so these campaigns, these big battles that were taking place in September, October, November of '67 were in fact regional campaigns that had been planned back in the spring and summer of 1967 because the communists had regional commands, they had their local objectives. And in fact, when the Americans are fighting at Dak To and Loc Ninh, the North Vietnamese Politburo still hadn't made up its mind whether it was going to do this thing called Tet, the general offensive, or exactly how it was going to happen or when it was going to happen. So these choices were still being made. And also, when you think about it, it always bugged me. Like, why would you launch a major operation in early November if you think that you're going to launch your big attacks, at the end of January? 3 months? You know how the Americans can move around. That's not a smart way of drawing forces away. What turned out to be the truth is the actual diversion operations were Khe Sanh, as most of us know, but also Dak To. This is mid-January 1968 when those operations take place. And their intent was not to draw the American forces away, who could move around as fast as they wanted to, but the South Vietnamese Joint General Reserve Forces, those paratrooper battalions and Marine battalions that were the only mobile reaction forces the South Vietnamese had. Those were the troops that were best positioned to turn back and attack against the cities, and that's who they were trying to draw in. Second point, it's been asserted that General Westmoreland was wedded to this notion of victory through attrition, right? That the way to succeed was to kill enough of the enemy that you cross this imaginary threshold and you could just kind of grind your way towards success. Also, with due respect to my friends who have argued otherwise, I don't think so. Westmoreland deserves far more credit than he has gotten, in my view. He was a very shrewd person who understood the value not just of combat operations and killing and body count, but also pacification. You see this in his support for Robert Comer and Cords. But also, I think the neglected thing is how he understood that interdicting North Vietnamese supply lines was a key to success, because there are different ways to reduce combat effectiveness. Killing a person, that's one way. But if you cut off his supplies, he doesn't have the bullets or the weapons or the medicine, then those are ways that you also reduce combat strength. And so this explains much of what Westmoreland was doing in '67, including this secret operation called Southpaw El Paso that he hoped to launch in early '68. He was building up a northern I-Corps to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That's what Khe Sanh was about. He wasn't just hanging the Marines out to dry. That was going to be the jumping off point through southern Laos. Dak To, same thing. That's why those battles took place in late '67, because the North Vietnamese knew that was a threat. So Westmoreland deserves more credit. Tet itself. It's been argued that Tet is a turning point. There's arguments for that, but on the whole, I would argue for continuity. I would say that U.S. policy, military policy, actually doesn't change very much. In fact, military policy had already been established before Tet. President Johnson had already confided to General Westmoreland in December '67 that he was not going to run again. Not surprising, Johnson was a sick man at that point. He had already served for 1.5 terms, and you can't run for re-election and also try to solve a war. He had already set the troop limit back in April of '67, effectively. Westmoreland already had a plan from '65 that there'd be 2 years of buildup, 2 years of maximum effort, and then a drawdown. So all those things were in place, but it was the optics, and that's true. That's different. The conditions upon which U.S. policy proceeded from that point proceeded under the cloud of the Tet Offensive, the pictures and images of burning cities and so forth. So in terms of public opinion, there was some effect. But again, U.S. policy didn't really change a great deal. And I'll also say one more thing. In my view, General Abrams, had he taken charge in April '67 when he came over to Vietnam, very little would have changed. Abrams and Westmoreland were actually very sympathetic, saw most things the same way. And the fact is, if you look at the war, you look at what's going on, 90% of the American military effort is already committed. There's things you have to do. You have to defend your bases, lines of communication, support pacifications, do the interdiction operations. There's not a lot of, room to maneuver. Around the edges a little bit, but not a lot. So I think what happens when Abrams takes over is the war had changed. The war is beginning to change. But you don't actually see a major change in the war until the middle of '69. Final point, Tet Offensive, we think of 31 January. Well, the first Tet goes from 30 January to 5 March, 3 phases, not 2, 3 phases. Then there's a second one, May, June. Third one, August, September '68. And a fourth one, right, Tet '69. Only after Tet '69, after the exhaustion of the communist forces and after Vietnamization began to take hold, that's when both sides changed policy. But really, you look at the year after Tet, Abrams is still wanting to cross the border, still wanting to fight the big battles, still doing all the other things that Westmoreland had done. So those are some of the takeaways. And again, I can't say enough about how great the National Archives is. If you can get out here and get around in the sources, it really is amazing. And I just say thank you again so much for having me here, and pass it over to my friend Merle, who can tell you more about the Vietnamese communist sources.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember that the sources that we study when studying what the Vietnamese were thinking about, the kind of documentation that we get to learn what the Vietnamese strategy and tactics and what they did throughout the period of Tet are written and produced by citizens of a dictatorial one-party communist state. So you have to look at that material with a bit of a jaundiced eye. As Reagan said, trust but verify. You have to collate everything. You have to compare it with the information that comes from the American side and see what, how it stacks up. What I have found in looking for the last 20-some years, ever since I retired, at the Vietnamese sources, is that there's a great deal of propaganda in the sources. However, the Vietnamese also have a great love of history and a great desire to, kind of across the board, for them to tell their children and their grandchildren what they did and why they did it. And there's a lot of individuals that push this. There's the party on one side, but a lot of individuals, generals and colonels, even lower level people that want to pass on their experiences and explain, kind of why they did what they did and why their families made the kind of sacrifices that they had to make. So surprisingly, in a lot of the publications, if you kind of get through the propaganda and kind of put that aside, you'll find some very frank and very honest discussions of what happened, why it happened, the problems that they had, the mistakes they made, and we talk on our side. We have focused so much in the history of the Vietnam War on what happened with the Americans, and we have forgotten that however screwed up we felt our army was, our commanders were, we weren't prepared, we didn't know this was going to happen, there was no planning, etc. If you look at it from the Vietnamese side, they were saying exactly the same thing, again and again. In Chi Tien, the attack on Hue, when the military region commander there first, and this is discussed in, he discussed it in a big forum that the Vietnamese had back around 20 years after the Tet Offensive to discuss the Tet Offensive. And he said when he first heard the plan, he said, well, gee, maybe somebody up there knows what they're doing. We're just a secondary theater. You say we're supposed to go in and take the city. Everybody else is going to be doing it. I guess we can give it a shot too. We're not going to do it for very long. And they were very skeptical. And these things come across in Vietnamese publications. For instance, their military history journals. They write, there's several big histories of the war that were produced for the general public. There are smaller histories of divisions, of regiments, provinces, military regions, all that have a great deal of detail on individual battles. And again, you have to push past the propaganda, and when you do, you will find a lot of things that make sense, that track with what the Americans saw happening, and I think that helped to explain why, in many respects, the Americans didn't believe such a thing could happen, because the Vietnamese didn't have that capability. A lot of the Vietnamese felt exactly the same way. Yeah. They felt exactly the same way. And there are some really telling memoirs that have been written, at least portions of the memoirs are very telling, by various generals, various generals, military commanders, kind of across the board. Nguyen Huan, who commanded the 1st Division, Nguyen Com Tan, who commanded Subregion 3, which was the attack into Saigon from the south into Chelan. A general named Phum Batung, who commanded 24th Regiment in the attack on Kon Tum. And let me read something that he said with regards to that attack, because he got various orders about what he was supposed to do. On the 27th of January, like 3 days before the attack, he received orders to attack the capital from the east. A couple days later, he was told, no, you're going to attack it from the north. Then they told him just before the attack, okay, we want you to send half of your officers and NCOs back to the rear so that we can form a new regiment. He's got an attack coming immediately. And this is what he writes. After I received this message, I discussed it with my regimental political commissar. I said, the regiment has been ordered to launch an attack into the city. Our precise target is unclear. We do not have a clear picture of the enemy situation. We are attacking pursuant to orders from higher authority, and now they have ordered us to pull out half of our cadres. How in the world is the regiment supposed to be able to accomplish its mission? Well, it didn't. He was relieved of command, reduced in rank. It took him a couple of years to get back into his career path, and he ended up as a general. He clearly was very bitter about how he was treated and how his unit was treated, because he lost a lot of people. There's another memoir by the Subregion 3 commander. Now, his was especially poignant because not only did he lose a lot of men, he lost his son. He was a native Southerner who did not go to the north, came up through the ranks. His son wanted to follow his father from the age of 14. To protect his son, he brought him into his security detail to protect his headquarters. As they're on the outskirts of Saigon, between the first, the second, the third wave of the Tet Offensive, and they were not allowed to pull back. They were told to hold their positions on the outskirts of Saigon and stay there. His son was killed in an artillery attack on the headquarters. And this is what he writes. Even today, every time I recall these events, my mind is still filled with confusion. From a purely military standpoint, it would have been impossible to reach the decision to attack and seize control of Saigon with the tactics and forces that were actually employed without the military attack being coordinated with a general uprising. But why did the political part of the offensive never materialize? What were the conditions among the masses and the students of Saigon that led our people to reach the conclusion that millions of people were boiling over with revolutionary zeal and were prepared to sacrifice everything for the cause of independence and freedom? When we entered Saigon, we found that this assessment was incorrect. For me, Tet 68 was the most anxious period in my entire career as a combat commander. My tension was caused not by the ferocity of the fighting, but was instead the result of the impossible task of trying to resolve the contradictions between the requirements of the mission and the forces and methods that were to be used to accomplish the mission. In this situation, the commander's hands were tied. He said, once I said to my political officer, let's just go ahead and pull our forces back to the rear to regroup them so that we can then recapture the liberated areas. The political officer replied, If we do that, not only will we lose sub-region 3, you and I will also lose our heads. So the 304th Division history. 304th Division was one of the divisions assigned to the siege of Khe Sanh. They sat on the outskirts, and they were there the longest. They were there from January through May, just almost to June. They took horrendous casualties right from the start. There's a memoir by a general who at that time was a battalion commander in 66th Regiment of the 304th Division. They lost 300 men in a B-52 strike, essentially about the time the siege started. They were marching into position. They were hit by 2 B-52 cells as they're in march formation that took out 1 battalion and part of the regiment headquarters. And then as men went in to try to pick up the pieces and get the wounded, another 52 strike in and took out even more of them. They talk about problems in discipline, they had units refuse their orders, units fell back without authority. One of a company that was holding Long Vay, which had been the old Long Vay camp, which was outside of the Long Vay that was overrun, without permission pulled back and didn't tell anybody. The Americans moved in, took that position, and Vietnamese artillery didn't even know didn't know that it happened, so they couldn't even shell the Americans because they thought their own troops were still there. After the siege was over, the 304th pulled back into North Vietnam, and they did a big review of their performance and assessed, who issued commendations and disciplinary, punishment and that kind of thing. This is what is written in the 304th Division history. This is in the division history. It talks about a problem that arose during the campaign and that received serious attention from the division involved a number of incidents that revealed the combat resolve of our troops was neither high nor uniform, and that combat discipline was not sufficiently strict. The lack of a consistently high spirit of resolve and combat discipline throughout the division was also demonstrated in a number of incidents of desertion and self-inflicted wounds. The division instituted disciplinary proceedings against a total of 399 individuals, including proceedings against 186 party members and 85 cadres from platoon level upward. Disciplinary measures carried out included expulsion from the party, reprimands, warnings, removal from command positions, and demotion. A number of these cases were presented for prosecution in military courts. And something that's in one of their campaign studies, which is after the war, the Vietnamese did just what the U.S. Army does. They did tactical reviews, they did battle studies, they did reviews of campaigns to learn lessons from them, to assess how they had performed, what their weaknesses were, what their strengths were, and everything else. In the Tet 68 Saigon campaign study, it says the following in lessons learned about strategic guidance. The reason we set strategic goals that were too high was primarily because our assessment of the situation was incorrect. The assessment did not truly reflect the actual situation. The Central Committee's assessment underestimated the capabilities of the puppet army and puppet government, that's the South Vietnamese army and government. The assessment underestimated the response of American military forces. The assessment overestimated the capabilities of our political forces, and especially our political forces in the cities. And that was a conclusion that was reached by the Party Central Committee itself in an assessment that it made 5 years, 5 years after the Tet Offensive in 1973. And one of the reasons for their problems, they said, was because their subordinate, because they weren't getting the truth told up through the chain of command. We have talked, in our history of the war, we talk about, the problem of body count and inflation of the body count, and reporting things that maybe were grossly or over-optimistic. The Vietnamese had exactly the same problem. They wrote in one of their lessons learned, the realities of the spring '68 strategic offensive reveal that reports from lower levels to higher levels generally did not accurately or even closely reflect the realities of the situation. They usually exaggerated accomplishments and did not report mistakes and shortcomings. This led these authorities to make policy decisions that were not in line with the situation and to set goals that were too high. And this part, I'll end with this one because I think it applies on our side as well as on theirs. Higher level authorities must be willing to listen to the opinions of subordinates. They must encourage subordinates to express their own independent thoughts in an open and sincere manner, especially those ideas that differ from or that are opposed to their own views. A leader must be willing to look truth in the eye, to hear subordinates out completely, and to encourage subordinates to tell him the truth. A leader must not be afraid to hear bad things, and he must not only want to hear good things. He must not be overbearing and domineering toward the ideas and opinions of his subordinates when those subordinates are simply speaking the truth.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. I want to especially thank the National Archives for hosting this event and for the Center of Military History for bringing us out here this evening. Chapman University is about 10-15 minutes away from the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Archives, and we have the distinct privilege of taking our students there, and I can tell you that the National Archives is quite simply a national treasure, pun intended. As we're in the rotunda upstairs, a friend of mine, we're trying to figure out how Nicolas Cage actually got in there to steal the Declaration of Independence. We'll work on that a little bit later. It's also a privilege this evening, sir, to be with Secretary Hagel, and I want to congratulate Erik on this monumental accomplishment. I know for scholars like me of the Vietnam War, the Center of Military History series is an invaluable resource, and I also want to publicly thank you, Merle, for being a resource like you and John Carlin in the audience and Erik's work. There are quite literally hundreds and hundreds of scholars that mention Merle and rely on Merle for his insights from the Vietnamese perspective, which I think is an incredibly important part of the story that too often Americans tend to forget, that at the end of the day that this was a Vietnamese conflict as much as it was, if not more so, than an American one. So the story of Tet, I believe, is often painted as a military victory turned political defeat. Oftentimes, that storyline is depicted as one in which it's the Americans' fault, that it is a triumph forsaken, if you will. And there are certain elements of that story that I think are important, but what I'd like to talk about tonight is what happens when we assume. And since we're on C-SPAN, I'll just leave it at that. But I want to talk a little bit tonight about how the Tet Offensive is really, I think, a tutorial in flawed assumptions, especially when it comes to developing strategy. And in one part, I believe, in large part, strategy is an aspirational art. We aspire to accomplish things when we plan. And strategy is also, I think, a balancing act between means and ends. And in one sense, I think you can calculate means, but the ends are
in a sense, aspirational. You desire to accomplish those objectives. You hope that the means will be applied in a way that will accomplish your ultimate political objectives. And I think what you see in Tet on all sides is a historical case study of flawed assumptions. From the beginning of this storyline, which I think really starts almost in the spring, if not earlier, of 1967, is a fundamental assumption on all sides that the Vietnam conflict is stalemated. And there are repercussions that come out of those assumptions. On the American side, there is a nearly year-long salesmanship campaign that is orchestrated by the Lyndon Johnson White House to help ensure that the United States home front is aware that, in fact, the military command in Vietnam and the South Vietnamese allies are, in fact, making progress, that the war is not stalemated. There is an assumption among senior military commanders, not only in Washington, D.C., but just as importantly in Saigon, that because the war is stalemated, they are going to lose public will and public support at home, and that's going to have a long-term, if not short-term and long-term, deleterious effect on not only planning strategy, but accomplishing those political objectives that are laid out as part of that strategy. And there are also repercussions on the Vietnamese side. Because of the assumption that the war is stalemated in 1967, ultimately, the Hanoi Politburo, by this point led by Lê Duan, comes to the conclusion that the war has to be broken, and the stalemated war has to be broken, and ultimately this will be achieved by a general offensive and general uprising. And this general offensive is assumed to accomplish what Lê Duan calls a decisive victory. And this decisive victory will not only occur simultaneously, but hopefully will also lead to a general uprising among the South Vietnamese population. Merle already sort of alluded to this, right? That there is this assumption that just bubbling below the surface is this revolutionary spirit among the South Vietnamese population that is, as soon as this general offensive takes place, it will crack the surface and allow this revolutionary spirit to bubble up. And this general uprising will occur not just in the rural countryside, but also in the urban cities. It will prove to the Vietnamese, it will prove to the Americans, it will prove to the world that this Vietnamese conflict is about independence, and the Saigon regime is illegitimate, and the true independence is best served by coming together and unifying under the Hanoi government. There's also an assumption, I think, on the North Vietnamese side that the Saigon political regime is racked by instability and corruption. And there are certain elements to the truth to that. But those assumptions don't play out as well, as we can see by how the Tet Offensive unfolds. That there are certain elements of political stability that start to play out coming out of the 1966 elections in South Vietnam. Yes, the Saigon regime is still dealing with corruption. Yes, there's still tenuous relationships between the local population and the Saigon government that still need to be worked on, and that's the part of, as Eric was mentioning earlier, this comprehensive American campaign that is trying to meld combat operations with pacification. And this aim of pacification, yet another assumption, I would argue, of American strategy, of Americans coming from the outside in and helping the South Vietnamese build bonds, political bonds, and build loyalties between themselves and their local government, is part of this holistic strategy, I think, that, as Eric has found, and I have as well in my own scholarship, that Westmoreland does not, in fact, get quite enough credit for planning. Now, that there are clearly issues in terms of implementation of this holistic strategy, oftentimes because of other assumptions that are made in issues then, and I would argue now, of counterinsurgency and nation building as they're related to military operations, that there are difficulties of this holistic strategy of military operations working at cross purposes, if not sometimes undermining nation building efforts, that military operations will oftentimes destabilize the countryside, will cause social dislocation, will increase the refugee population, that will all further destabilize the social political fabric and tear away at those threads of the Saigon political community that will work against this larger political objective of nation building. There are also assumptions from an operational standpoint, as both Merle and Erik have alluded to, especially as we move from 1967 and into 1968, when Westmoreland staff, especially the intelligence staffs, make certain assumptions about what the enemy is capable of achieving in late 1967 and 1968. That in part there is a focus on Khe Sanh because there are also historical assumptions that are being made, that many in the Johnson White House and many in the Saigon military command, especially American officers in Westmoreland's command, see a historical comparison between the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu in the French Indochina War, which ultimately that garrison will be overrun and will lead quickly to the Geneva Accords, that there is a concern and assumption that there are parallels between the Marine garrison at Khe Sanh being overrun and having political repercussions that will, like Dien Bien Phu, lead to a swift turnaround of the enemy, or swift turnaround of the strategic calculations that are being made in late 67 and early 1968. And there are also assumptions being made, as I mentioned, in terms of not only what the enemy is capable of, but what the enemy consists of. That there is large debate in 1967 that leads into 1968 and into 1969 of what the enemy actually consists of. This debate known as the order of battle debate that occurs between MACV headquarters and CIA and elements of the White House and the Department of Defense get all involved in this larger debate of simply counting your enemy. How do you develop a strategic plan? How do you make solid assumptions about your strategic context when you can't even come to a consensus about how many enemy you are confronting? Clearly a difficult proposition as you're trying to craft not only a sensible strategy, but also one that is achievable. And these debates will continue throughout 1967 and I would argue into the Tet era as well, that will have repercussions not only in the development of Westmoreland's strategy from the American side, but will also have repercussions in terms of how this salesmanship campaign lays out in 1968, because the American public themselves are also making assumptions based on the propaganda campaign that is being led by the Johnson White House. When General Westmoreland comes home in 1967 on numerous occasions, when Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker comes home as well and says that we are making progress, when the Johnson White House says we are making progress, there are certain expectations and assumptions that are made based on those progress reports. And those expectations get burst when this offensive begins in in January 1968 and early 1960, in January and early February of 1968. So I think it's important for us all to think about Tet not only as a military victory turned political defeat, but also a tutorial for us to think about how we make certain assumptions when it comes to war. Whether it's the revolutionary spirit of the South Vietnamese, whether it's the political instability of the South Vietnamese, whether it's what we can accomplish when we employ military force. Now, many of those assumptions, I would argue, and I think as Erik's study not only goes through the Tet phase, but also leads you into 1969 as well, many of those assumptions that Erik lays out very, very well in his history are shown to be false, flawed assumptions. The problem is now after the war, as we begin to write our history of the American experience of Vietnam, we have to start squaring those circles of those assumptions as we start to write our history. And I would argue that many of the myths that we continue to embrace in Vietnam come from those assumptions and our inability to reconcile squaring those circles as we come to figure out what this event meant for us all. One of them, I would suggest, is an assumption that the American media was to blame. There's a strand of that that is important for us to consider. But I would argue that that's not the whole story, and I would suggest to you all that we should be careful of one-word assumptions and explanations when trying to come to a decision about what happened in Tet and what happened in the larger overall American experience in Vietnam. That if we can conclude that an incredibly complex and complicated war, that the reason for the results of that war are because of the American media, that maybe we're coming to too simplistic of an explanation for why the outcome, the inglorious outcome, as Secretary Hagel mentioned, perhaps that's too simplistic and too reductive of an answer. And maybe we should look for other narratives that all impinge upon this, that history is more than just a search for simplicity and reduction and simple one-word answers to understanding a complex historical case study. There's also an assumption, I believe, based on this attempt to square the circle with what happened in Tet, and Erik's alluded to this, that there is this savior general that comes in after Tet and completely turns the war around. And again, I would argue that we need to be careful with that, not only in the context of what happened in 1968, but also as we think about our own experiences more recently, about assuming how much one general, one American general, can turn a war around on a dime. That includes so many other things, local issues of political, military, economic, developmental aspects of a complex war that is both local and regional, that is about identity, that has oftentimes many things to do not at all with the American foreign policy in the Cold War era. So we should ask ourselves how we might think about this portion of the story and these assumptions about how much impact a major modern general has on the course and conduct of war. And I think we also need to be careful of certain assumptions about how we think about history writ large, of assuming that history is a search for blame. And oftentimes in the aftermath of Tet, in the aftermath of Vietnam, many Americans in particular wanted to use Vietnam and the history of Vietnam as a search for blame. And I would suggest as a historian that may not be the best value of history. That history isn't an opportunity for us to place blame. That rather it's an opportunity for us to gain perspective. I think one of the best things that we can take out of the Ken Burns and Lynn Novak documentary is an opportunity for us to empathize with folks with whom we might disagree. And one of the beauties, I think, of that documentary is to see this complex conflict through the eyes of so many different people that disagreed. Anti-war activists, journalists, fighters from the National Liberation Front, propaganda officers, South Vietnamese officers and civilians, American military commanders, young Marines, families who lost their sons, women who served as nurses and in the Red Cross. And many of these voices, oftentimes during the war itself, were in conflict with each other. And the value of history as we are farther and farther removed from those events is to empathize with those voices, not to seek blame. And I think that's an important thing for us to consider as we look back on Vietnam. And the last thing I would like to suggest is, as we look back at this episode 50 years on, as we try to gain perspective from this larger offensive, is that perhaps we should not assume too much from what war can offer. That these participants in 1967 and 1968 assumed that military action would give them something, would offer them a path, oftentimes a decisive path, to achieving political objectives. And so we should challenge those assumptions today. We should challenge our own assumptions about the efficacy of military power leading in the most direct way, as a shortcut, if you will, to achieving our political objectives. Because perhaps one of the perspectives we can gain from looking back 50 years on from Tet is that perhaps sometimes military action, if we don't over-assume, might in fact not be the best tool in all situations for us to achieve the political objectives we desire. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we will, we've got about 15 minutes for some questions and answers. I think I'll begin. And an interesting question. I'll begin, and I think the way we'll proceed with these is that we'll ask them to the panel as a whole, and we'll let you gentlemen react and kind of interplay with them. And our first question is, what are the parallels between Vietnam and the current conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq?
Oh.
I think we should just all look right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
My answer would be, I think these eminent historians gave the answer, especially your last comments, that use of the military has to always be framed and connected to a larger diplomatic strategic objective. And if you disconnect the use of your military from that, you're going to fail. You're going to fail. And I think the Afghan-Iraq situation is somewhat parallel to Vietnam. And it always is going to go back to and revert to the fact that it is the people of that country, that region, that will determine outcomes. If for no other reason than in a democracy like the United States of America, the people of America are not going to allow their country to continue in a never-ending war with casualties and billions of dollars being spent, and without the support or enough support and enough ability of the countries we're trying to help to at least find some semblance of responsibility to take over from the United States. I mean, I think of Afghanistan and Iraq. I was in the Senate when those wars started. I remember in the committee hearings in the Foreign Relations Committee, we would ask the secretaries, the deputy secretaries, the generals, and all gave the same answers. We'll be out of there in a year. We'll be out of there in 2 years. I mean, we had the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, testify that Iraq wouldn't cost the American people $1 because of the Iraqi oil. And so when you start to see a disconnect between your leaders as to what they're telling representatives of the people in the Congress, not unlike what we know about Vietnam, and I don't think it's an intentional, malicious kind of thing, that's a parallel. And I think you could draw other parallels as well. Each is separate, each is different parts of the world to start with, different cultures, different histories, different dynamics, absolutely, but there are parallels.
If I could sort of turn that 90 degrees to make a pitch for the value of history, center of military history, and all that good stuff. Tell you one thing from my point of view, because I got to CMH in 2000. And so when Iraq and Afghanistan started, from my point of view, the thing that really struck me is the fact that we had not retained the lessons of Vietnam, right? When you suddenly have thin-skinned Humvees getting blown up by IEDs in heavily urbanized areas, and people going, whoa, wait a minute. Have we been through this sort of thing? Do we have Vietnam gun trucks? You know, manuals of IEDs. I mean, this information is available, but just hadn't been put in the right hands. Abu Ghraib. I spent 6 months writing a special paper on detaining operations, you know, based on history, but particularly Vietnam War, Geneva rights, how we handled prisoners, because of that. Again, it's not a new story. We don't seem to be very successful at retaining those lessons. But again, it's a plea that we probably ought to, because on the ground, if nothing else, I think it's going to save some American lives if we understood what has come before. You know, the geopolitics, that's important too. But I'm thinking in terms of those soldiers. You know, when I went over to Afghanistan in 2010 and saw a 22-year-old first lieutenant waved to his troops, they drove off in their strikers like a mom to their kids going to school. I mean, that's what it's about. So.
Great, thank you. And if I could actually, I'm gonna do a synthesis of a number of questions here that I've got in front of me, and they really relate to intelligence and the Tet Offensive. So really, just to summarize them, one of these is really well written and kind of sums it up. The Tet Offensive has often been described as an intelligence failure. Do you agree with this analysis? What role did that order of battle controversy play in establishing the conditions that led to the offensive? And then, looking to Tet, what were the intelligence points that were either known but not planned for, or missed completely, and why?
I'll take a stab at it.
In terms of intelligence, I think clearly it was an intelligence failure because there was a nationwide surprise. On the other hand, and there had been efforts by both Saigon Station, the analytical office there, and NSA to put out a warning that something big was coming, and it was going to be very big. And that was not accepted because A, it was politically inconvenient, and B, people felt it was impossible. In other words, these people, you know, the Vietnamese wouldn't be crazy enough to do something like that. Well, we didn't understand the Vietnamese. We put the Vietnamese in our, you know, in our shoes. They were in their shoes, and we have to make sure that we try to understand the situation and see the situation from the enemy's perspective and not from our own. And that's where we failed.
I'll tell you another thing that really struck me, and this is getting back to some points we made earlier, is the amount of the operational secrecy on the side of the communists was pretty extraordinary. I mean, they're a disciplined bunch of folks as just normal course of action. But the compartmentalization of information was so severe that literally, I mean, I sort of, when I first read this, I kind of had to laugh. Okay, imagine this. One of the sub-region commanders, basically you might think of him like a 2-star, 3-star general, attacking Saigon, gets the word that his forces were supposed to attack the city in 24 hours. He gets this out of the blue. He's thinking, oh, we're going to attack in March or April, when we get our act together. No, it's going to be tomorrow. So he goes running off to find his subordinate commanders. He finds one of his battalion commanders roaring drunk, on Tet wine, completely useless. Finds, another executive officer who's, with his family, doesn't know where the troops are. So part of the reason that there was an intelligence failure to some extent, or to a major extent, is the fact that communists were actually so good at keeping a secret, their own people didn't know, which of course led to a lot of problems when the actual attack happened. I mean, there's story after story of communist units, getting there late, or their guides ran off, or they crossed the wrong river, or, it's just like Keystone Cops out there. So they sacrifice their execution for their operational secrecy, and that's one of the trade-offs.
Yeah, and that's, that's a theme that goes across the Vietnamese accounts. In just case after case, units get the word that they're supposed to launch an attack, without any time to even make it to their assembly point. There's a memoir by a general who ended up as chief of the general staff in Hanoi. At the time of Tet, he was a company commander with the 9th Division. And he was with a regiment that was supposed to attack the Quang Chum Training Center outside of Saigon, which is a big South Vietnamese training center, and they were going to overrun it and then move down into Saigon. They get to, they get the word at the last minute. They get to a river. There are only enough boats for one company to cross the river. So his company is the first company across. They get to Quang Chum. They make the attack. They got one company in a training center that's probably got 10,000 soldiers. And, they hit the headquarters. They're there for a while, and they have to pull out, and they lose people all over the place. Nobody else makes it, okay? So they were their own worst enemy in that, and that just goes across the board. There is a reason, that you have to balance operational secrecy with operational rationality. And Tet, in many respects, was a big there was a big unbalance in that equation.
All right. Well, I think we've reached the end of our question and answer time. I'd like to, first of all, thank Secretary Hagel and our panelists for a great evening. And I'd like to thank you all again for coming tonight. Out in the front area, Erik will be signing copies of the book, which are available for sale. We've also got a CMH display of our remaining Vietnam history publications, and I encourage you to stick around and ask more questions as we wrap up the night. Thank you all.
All right, good job. Nicely done. Yeah, nicely done.